Today's story is a frightening demonstration of why women tend to gather in groups before they go anywhere, and that this behavior didn't come out of nowhere and is something that crosses time, space, and culture. But it's also a very stark reminder that even within the walls of a place as apparently safe as the Imperial Palace, there are things that move through the shadows, waiting for a chance to pounce on a solitary victim. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to yet another classical Japanese folktale. And if you like Japanese history, Japanese culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to give the video a like. Please subscribe to the channel because I do put out at least one new Tales video every single week. And with all of that out of the way, I will also say I did mess around with the lighting a little bit to kind of give it a little bit more of a spooky atmosphere, because we are in the section dealing with ghosts and demons, and is the closest thing that we have to a scary story section in this collection of Japanese folktales called the Konjaku Monogatari Shu. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's get on with today's story. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi, in the reign of the Komatsu Emperor, who is more commonly known as Emperor Koko, there was a group of 3 girls on their way back from a place in the Imperial Palace complex known as the Butokuden. And that is a word that can be translated to something like the Hall of Martial Virtue. Now this Butokuden, this was a place where the emperor could enjoy viewing feats of daring do, like archery or various activities done from horseback, i.e. those things that the ancient Japanese of the time associated with warriors. Hence the name Butokuden. Now this Butokuden hall was next to a big space called the En no Matsubara, or the Pine Field of Parties. And as the name suggests, it was a large open field with a few pine trees scattered here and there. Now, as mentioned before, these 3 girls had been at the Butokuden for whatever undisclosed reason. We can only guess. And they were currently walking through this pine field, this En no Matsubara, headed toward the main palace building. It was on the night of the 17th of the 8th month, and if you're familiar with the Japanese/Chinese lunar calendar, this basically meant that it was a fairly cool night in early autumn, and the moon was out and shining very, very brightly. Brightly enough that the girls could actually see fairly well and weren't particularly concerned about anything skulking around in the dark, even though the shadows were still dark and it was nigh impossible to see anything in them. They were, after all, in the middle of the Imperial Palace, perhaps the safest place in the whole country, and even though the shadows were deep, they could see pretty much everything else without much of an issue. And so they very casually made their way through this open field, confident that there was absolutely zero chance of some ne'er-do-well springing out of the dark and robbing them of their clothes and other valuables, or what have you. And so they carried on toward the more populated areas of the palace complex, happily chatting away, cracking jokes, and giggling at each other in much of the same way that young girls do today when they're hanging out with their friends. All in all, these girls were having a really good time. Again, we don't know why they were at the Butokuden to begin with. Perhaps there was some sort of a display of martial prowess that they wanted to see, some sort of warrior event that was happening. And again, this place that they were currently in was called the En no Matsubara, En meaning something like party. So perhaps there was some sort of an event. Although, as you will come to find out, they were largely alone. But as they were going along, chatting with each other, enjoying each other's company, and still having a good time on their way back from whatever it was they were doing, their revelry was suddenly interrupted when they heard someone call out to them in a deep, masculine voice, immediately followed by a well-dressed man emerging from the shadow of one of the pine trees near them. This man, slowly, casually, but very confidently, made his way toward them, his dashing smile clearly visible in the bright moonlight. The girls stopped, and there was a brief moment of surprise until the man let loose a string of some of the smoothest talk any of them had ever had the pleasure of hearing. While this sudden appearance of a very fine man made all of their hearts flutter a bit, One of the girls in particular found this whole thing particularly appealing and decided to indulge this handsome stranger in his nighttime gallantry. I mean, after all, the moon was shining beautifully, he was dressed very fancily, and being inside the walls of the palace complex, clearly he was far from any scoundrel. And his voice and words were as clean and smooth as the sweetest rice wine you've ever tasted. With an amorous glint in her eye, this girl replied invitingly, and moved to meet this suave stranger. Eventually, they both closed the distance, and the man, taking the girl's hand in his own, pulled her into the shadow of this pine tree, and began talking to her in a low, soothing voice. And she, understandably, began returning his sultry words with her own. Now, the remaining two girls understood exactly what was going on. This was not new for any of them. This man had seen that a group of nice-looking girls were crossing the pine field and had set up an amorous ambush in the hopes that he could whisper sweet nothings to one of them for a bit while holding her in his arms under the shadow of a pine tree, and then hopefully set up something a little more romantic in the future. The two other girls maybe rolled their eyes in mild annoyance, or maybe instead they were giddy to ask their friend who this man was, or maybe instead they were just giddy to ask their friend who this man was, and what their plans for the future rendezvous were, and what sorts of scandalous sweet nothings they had whispered to each other under the light of a full moon. Whatever they were thinking, they nonetheless obligingly moved a fair distance away from the lovebirds, gave them plenty of space, and positioned themselves so that they were just out of sight, but close enough that if they needed to, they could jump in if the lady needed rescuing from a man who didn't understand the concept of no. Though it looked like they weren't going to have to do that at all with how sweetly and nicely these two were talking to each other. And then these two other girls waited. They had assumed, that it wouldn't take that much time. It's not like they were in a place to get really intimate with each other, and they all had places to be. They assumed that they would share enough words to get to know each other's names, concoct a few witty and suggestive love poems, set up a future correspondence, and then maybe throw in a few sappy lines about how much this moonlit night felt like a dream. Typical lovey-dovey kind of small, sweet nothings. The two unwooed girls chatted away with each other for a bit while they waited, but the minutes began to drag on, and with it, the girls' annoyance and impatience grew. At first, they hadn't been paying too much attention to their friend and her pining new boyfriend. Again, they wanted to make sure that they were given the appropriate space. But now that it was taking so long, they stopped their chatting and listened closely, trying to hear if maybe the new couple were wrapping things up. Hopefully. It was at this point that both of the girls realized they actually couldn't hear a thing from them. Not the hushed sounds of smiling love talk, not the soft laughing of amorous teasing, not the earnest pledges of love or the exasperated sighs of lovers at parting. Nothing. Had their conversation finished? And they were now just holding each other, not wanting to part ways? I mean, that was a little strange for two people who had just met. This is not how things tended to work in this time. So, finally agreeing that it was time to break up this little love show, no matter the feelings of their friend, the two girls left the little nook that they had been waiting in and began making their way over to the pine tree. But as they approached and began scanning the tree, they noticed that the shadow of the trunk didn't have an unnatural couple-shaped bulge in it. It was just straight as a board. Well, maybe they were hugging each other really, really tightly and just hidden on the other side of this tree. So the girls crept closer until they could easily see around the tree and found no sign of the lovers. Had they gone somewhere else? Of course they did. What else could explain it? Now the girls were really annoyed, okay? This friend had clearly ditched them to go run off with some random new boy toy to heaven only knows where. Had she no shame? Didn't she know that they had things to do? How could she leave them high and dry, probably to indulge her own immediate carnal appetites, while clearly putting up none of that elegant resistance that all the Heian ladies were supposed to insist on? These two remaining girls were just about to leave in a mutual huff, when something odd, laying on the floor by the base of the tree, caught one of their eyes. Something glowing white in the light of the full moon and standing out from the darker shade of the ground. This girl then spotted another one of these white things, not far from the first, white as could be, mind you, the size of a decent-sized rock, reflecting the brilliant moonlight. What were those? She pointed it out to the other girl, who also found it odd. Together they moved a little closer, trying to make out these things' shapes, until they recognized that on one end of each of these things was the bent, slender figure of fingers on one end, and on the other end of each of these things, the torn, bleeding edge. These were hands. Human hands, the kind that looked like they belonged to a pretty lady, their friend's hands. Needless to say, the two girls were terrified. The story doesn't mention if they screamed, but I can only assume that they did. But luckily for them, they wasted no time in sprinting as fast as they could to the headquarters of the palace guard and explained, probably through tears and gasps, what they had just found. The guards themselves also wasted no time in gathering a team, outfitting themselves with whatever they thought they might need, and heading for the scene. When they arrived, they performed a sweep of the whole place, but could only locate the delicate yet grisly hands of this young woman. There was no sign of any other clothing, hair, body, nothing. By this time, though, all of the hubbub had actually attracted a small crowd of people, all watching with wide eyes as the guards did their work. Speculation and fear spread through them as they tried to puzzle out what had happened, and if they also needed to be scared. I mean, this was the Imperial Palace complex, for crying out loud. These kinds of gruesome deaths were something that happened with Oni in abandoned houses out in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't supposed to happen here, in the heart of high-class society. Once it was clear that there was nothing more that could be done, the guards dispersed the crowd and everyone went back to their several places, wondering what happened, and if they too now had reason to be afraid. Of course, word of this whole event and the surviving girl's story eventually spread through the whole of the city, and the general consensus was that an Oni had somehow slipped into the greater palace complex and taken on the form of a dashing young man to lure away a trusting young maiden, where it could then devour her quickly and make its escape. And thus is it said that a young woman should always be vigilant of men whom they don't know, calling out to them and enticing them with all sorts of romantic indulgences, and refuse to fall for nice words, fancy clothes, and romantic moonlight. And that this whole catastrophe was indeed a horrifying occurrence. And that is actually the end of the story. So, if you did find that story amusing, please don't forget to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel because, like I said, I do put out at least one of these new Tales videos every week. And if you have been watching all the way up to the end here, I do thank you sincerely. Ito ureshu koso hanberi kere. And hopefully we will see you next week for the next story, which is a similar story about an Oni that ends up making it into the palace complex. But this time, it doesn't show up in some tree out in the middle of a big field that nobody is walking through in the middle of the night. No, this time it's found in an even more distressing place. And it also shows that it wasn't just the ladies that had cause to be afraid. Oni don't find the sexes to taste any different. And that's going to be it for me, everybody. Have a good one. We'll see you later. Goodbye.